Hello, class, and welcome to today's lecture on social perception and attribution. My name is Dr. Soggie, and I will be leading you through this lecture. Now, before we dive into the concepts, I want to invite you to just reflect on a few aspects of your everyday life that might relate to today's topic. So I'd like you to just think about the last time you met someone new, whether it was in a social situation or work environment or even just a brief encounter with a stranger. What was your first impression of them? What were the factors that went into shaping that impression? Was it something they said, their appearance, or perhaps their body language? Now, consider whether your initial judgment was accurate, or if you later found yourself revising that impression as you got to know that person a little bit better. Now, also, I want you to consider a time when someone tried to explain a behavior that you exhibited. Did they attribute your actions to something about your personality or to the situation that you were in? And how did their interpretation of your behavior affect your interaction with them? I just want you to think about those things, because that's basically what we're going to be covering today as we explore the topic of social perception and attribution. So in today's lecture, as always, I want to tell you a little story, but I also want to cover a few themes. And there's the theme of social perception and its processes, which is basically how do we form impressions and judgments about people based upon the social cues that we experience. And within this, we'll explore the processes that are involved in us perceiving others and what we observe and how we interpret and categorize those. Because all of those factors like context and previous experience and the kind of mental tricks that we play on each other all play a part. We call those cognitive shortcuts, to be more precise. Then we'll explore a little bit of attribution theory, which basically deals with how we explain the causes of behavior. What do we attribute the causes to in behavior? And we'll focus on the distinction between internal, or what we call dispositional, and external or situational attributions, and how people tend to attribute causes for their own and others' actions. And we'll give some special attention to what we call the common or fundamental attribution error, as well as other common attributional biases, like the actor-observer bias. And then finally, we'll roll out the theme of social cognition. That is, how do we mentally organize and interpret information about people and about social situations? And this is where the idea of schemas and heuristics and mental shortcuts that shape our perceptions and attributions come into play. And we'll explore the dual process models that explain how people process social information through both deliberate and automatic thinking systems. Now, as always, I like to start off with a little story about someone important in the field. And so today I want to introduce you to Fritz Heider, who is one of the most significant figures in the study of social perception and attribution. And he's really known for pioneering a lot of work in the field of social psychology. He was born in 1896 in Vienna, Austria, the same place that Freud worked and Alfred Adler grew up and Viktor Frankl grew up. So this is a hotbed of psychology. And Heider developed an interest in psychology very early on in his career, and this really kind of contributes and lays the groundwork for how we understand the ways in which people explain the behaviors of others and interpret social information. Now, Heider's most famous for developing attribution theory, which seeks to explain how people attribute causes to behaviors. And he proposed that people are basically naive scientists, and they're constantly trying to make sense of the world by attributing behavior either to internal dispositions, that is, the person's personality traits or their abilities, or to external situations like circumstances or environment. So this is something that is very important in the field of social psychology. The whole idea of how do we understand people, and how do we define people? Are we defining people by their dispositions or by their situations? Well, we tend to define ourselves in the most positive way, dispositionally, and if something negative happens, well, it's an external situation. But we tend to do the opposite to other people. We tend to minimize this external situation and emphasize the negative possible disposition, which is kind of interesting, I think. And that's something that Fritz Heider has kind of helped us to understand. And then there's another thing called the balance theory, which explains how individuals strive for consistency in their relationships and their attitudes, how they seek harmony between their thoughts and their feelings and their actions. And so really, overall, Fritz Heider's really worked to create a cornerstone in the whole field of social psychology, dealing with perception and attribution. And this foundation has gone on to kind of form the basis for other research on things like cognitive biases and how we misunderstand or misattribute behavior to others, and really to how we can oftentimes have false judgments of others within social context. So Fritz Heider, somebody that it's important to really remember and understand, because he contributed so much to our understanding of social situations. Now, let's dive into a little bit of social perception. What do we mean by social perception? It's really the process by which people form impressions and make judgments about others based upon what kind of information is available. And this might be their appearance or their behavior and their context. And it really encompasses how we observe and interpret and categorize the social cues that we encounter in everyday life. And understanding social perception is really essential in our daily lives because it significantly influences how our interactions and relationships and decision-making play out within the real world. Whether we're aware of it or not, we are constantly forming impressions of others. And those impressions shape how we behave towards them. So, for example, the first impression of a job interview can influence hiring decisions, and how we perceive someone's intentions can affect our response in social and conflict situations. And inaccurate perceptions can lead to misunderstandings and prejudice and strained relationships, while a more accurate understanding of others can improve empathy and communication and trust. And there are three primary processes that are involved in social perception. We start off with observation. That's the obvious initial step. We notice and we gather information from social cues, such as, facial expressions or tone of voice or body language in the context. And then we take those observations and we interpret or assign meaning to them. And the process can be influenced by our expectations, our prior experiences, and our biases. So in some ways, we're projecting onto the people. And then finally, we categorize the individual or situation based upon the information we've gathered and how we interpret that. And these often fit into pre-existing schemas or mental models, and how we interpret these are going to depend upon and how we categorize people is going to depend upon, first off, how good our interpretation is, how robust our interpretation to avoiding biases is, and how nuanced our categorizations are. And this brings us back to the whole idea of Fritz Heider, who proposed that people are motivated to understand the causes of behavior, and that his whole attribution theory that suggests that we explain behavior by attributing it either to the internal dispositions or the external situations. Now, later on, there's someone by the name of Solomon Asch that configured a model of impression formation, and in Asch's work, he demonstrated that people tend to form coherent overall impressions of others based upon a very limited amount of information, especially focuses on central traits like warmth or competence. And his research showed that early information, that is, primacy effect, can strongly influence the overall impression formed about someone. Then we get to attribution theory, which we've already talked about, and this is from Fritz Heider. Remember, he said that people are like naive scientists, and that they attribute behavior to personality traits, and that would be an internal dispositional attribution, or to their abilities, or to their character. So, for example, if someone succeeds on a test, an internal attribution would be that they are intelligent or hardworking. Then there's the external situational attribution. And these are explanations that attribute behavior to external circumstances or the environment. For example, if someone fails an exam, a situational attribution might be that the test was difficult or they didn't have enough time to prepare. Then there is the fundamental attribution error. And this is the idea that people have a tendency to overemphasize personality traits and internal characteristics while underestimating situational factors when explaining the behavior of others. Okay, we've already talked about this. So, for instance, if someone cuts you off in traffic, you might assume they're just a jerk, they're a rude person, and that would be a dispositional attribution, rather than considering that they may be in a rush because they have to get to an emergency room at a hospital, which would be a situational attribution. And we don't know either way, but we automatically make these kind of assumptions about others. And then there's the actor observer bias. And this highlights a related phenomenon that people tend to attribute their own behavior to situational factors while attributing others' behavior to internal characteristics. And that's something we've also talked about, that kind of a bias of how we judge ourselves versus others. So, for example, if you are late for a meeting, you might justify it by saying that traffic was bad. That's a situational attribution. But if someone else is late, you might think they are disorganized, and that would be a dispositional evaluation. So that's an idea that plays into this. Let's take a look now at social cognition in perception and attribution. So this is where we get into the whole idea of social schemas, because social cognition really refers to how we process and how we store and apply information about other people and social situations. So one of the key concepts of social cognition is the idea of a schema, which is really just a mental structure that organizes and interprets information. So if we're talking about a social schema, this is something that helps us to make sense of the vast amount of social information that we encounter every day while providing a framework for interpreting people's actions and behaviors. So, for example, we have schemas for social roles like a teacher or a student, which influence how we perceive and interact with people in their roles. And schemas are essential because they simplify complex social environments and allow us to make quick decisions. However, they can also lead to stereotyping, as we may rely just a little too heavily on the pre-existing schemas instead of paying attention to the unique characteristics of individuals. And so then we need to kind of think about heuristics, because in addition to schemas, social cognitions involve the use of heuristics, which are mental shortcuts that allow us to make quick judgments without extensive cognitive effort. And heuristics can be useful, but they can also lead to errors in attribution. So, two common heuristics that affect how we may make attributions are, first off, the availability heuristic, which is our tendency to judge the frequency or likelihood of an event based upon how easily the example comes to mind. So, for instance, if we can quickly recall examples of someone behaving selfishly, we may assume that selfishness is a common trait, even if it is not objectively true. And then there's the representative heuristic, and this heuristic involves judging the likelihood of something based on how similar it is to a typical case. So, for example, if someone appears to fit a stereotype or a particular social group, we may wrongly assume they possess all the typical traits associated with that group. Then we can think in terms of biases and errors. And because there's a lot of common biases in attribution. One of the first ones is something called the self-serving bias. And this is basically our tendency to attribute our successes to internal factors like our intellect, we're just smart, or we have exceptional skill, or we put in an exceptional amount of work, and our failures to external factors like bad luck and difficult circumstances. So, for example, if you get a good grade on a test, you might attribute that to your intelligence. But if you get a bad grade, you might blame the difficulty blame that on it being just an unfair, difficult exam. And that's a fairly common thing. It's a self-serving bias. Then there's what's called the just world bias. And this is the bias that reflects the belief that people get what they deserve. And they deserve what they get. And so this leads to the attribution of blaming the victim for their misfortunes. So, for example, assuming a person is poor because they're lazy. That would be an example of the just world bias, when in fact, the world isn't necessarily just or fair. There's a lot of things that play into the world. And then there's the dual process model. And in social cognition, this really operates through this dual process model, which suggests that people process information by two separate routes. And we can kind of think about there being two pathways of how we process social information. And the first one is what we call the central route. And this involves very thoughtful, slow, deliberate processing of information based upon the content and the quality of the argument. And this occurs when people are motivated and able to think critically about the situation at hand. And so it's slow thinking, but it's deep thinking, it's critical thinking. But then there's the peripheral route that also works. And this is a more automatic, a more superficial processing. It's an easier way of thinking, often based on cues such as attractiveness and emotions and authority rather than the actual content of the message. And one example of the dual process model is that whole elaboration likelihood model that we'll explore again and again in this class, which suggests that people engage in either central or peripheral processing depending upon factors such as what their motivation is, how smart they are, their cognitive ability, and the relevant information that's available. If there isn't lots of information available, then they might just default to the peripheral route and not take the central route. Let's talk now a little bit about impressions. How do we form impressions? We all form impressions, and a lot of what we do within our life is managing impressions. So we need to kind of be mindful of how others process their perceptions of us, and we receive what is managed by other people. And we can kind of think about first impressions and what our first impressions of others is. Now, research shows that people make very quick judgments based upon the absolute minimal amount of information. And we often refer to these as thin slices of behavior. So first impressions are typically formed within seconds of meeting someone and are influenced by a variety of factors such as their physical appearance, their facial expressions, their tone of voice, and their body language. And these early judgments can be remarkably resilient, even in the face of later contradictory information. And there are some key factors influencing first impressions, and these include, first off, the primacy effect, which is information presented early in an interaction, often that has more substantial impact than information presented later. And this is why initial impressions tend to dominate. And then there's stereotyping. And this is where people often rely on stereotypes when forming first impressions, especially when they have little other information to go on. Now, while stereotypes can be useful shortcuts, they can also lead to unfair and inaccurate judgments. And then there is impression management, because people don't just passively receive information from others, they also actively manage the impressions that they project. And so impression management is the idea that people have strategies that they use in order to influence how others perceive them. And these strategies can be conscious or unconscious and are used in various social settings, for example, in job interviews, to social gatherings. And there are some fairly common self-presentation techniques that people use. One is ingratiation. So that is behaving in ways intended to show oneself likable or attractive to others. And this might include, flattery or expressing agreement or showing kindness to someone. Then there is self-promotion. And this is highlighting one's achievements or abilities to be seen as competent or successful. There's also supplication, which is presenting someone as needy. So you're presenting yourself as needy or helpless. And what this does is elicit sympathy or help from others. It shows that the other person is more powerful than you and that you can then receive something from them. And then there's exemplification, which really kind of demonstrates moral integrity or self-sacrifice to gain admiration or respect from others. And so impression management is a vital tool for navigating social interactions. But it can also have ethical implications, especially when individuals manipulate their presentation for deceptive purposes. Now, there's also the idea of confirmation bias in this whole impression formation. So once a first impression is formed, people will then seek out information that confirms their initial judgment, while they have a tendency to ignore or downplay information that contradicts it. And this is known as confirmation bias. So, for example, if a person perceive someone as rude, you are more likely to notice behaviors that reinforce that perception, even if they are generally kind, understanding people. And confirmation bias can distort our understanding of others and lead to rigid or unjustified evaluations. So, there's a classic study in this whole idea of confirmation bias and the whole idea of impression management that comes from Erving Goffman's work. It's called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, and it's something back from I think it was 1959 or 1960. And Goffman described social interactions as performances where people present themselves in different ways depending upon the stage that they're on. Are they in a private setting, or they in a work setting, or some other setting? And according to Goffman, individuals are like actors. They manage how they're perceived by adjusting their behavior and their appearance and their speech based upon the situation. And his work laid the foundation for understanding how social contexts influence the way people present themselves. And this has some implications because first impressions and impression management plays crucial roles in social interaction. So whether it is personal relationships or professional settings or social media, the ability to navigate these processes can affect outcomes such as, how much you trust someone, or how much you cooperate with someone, or how much social success you end up having within your life. So there's a lot of things that play out in this whole realm of information formation and management. Let's go on now and just talk a little bit about nonverbal communication, because this is, conveying information without using words. What are the things that we do, like our facial expressions and our body language and our gestures and our eye contact and our tone of voice? These nonverbal cues play really a crucial role in how we interpret others' emotions, how we interpret their attitudes and intentions. And in many cases, nonverbal communication can carry way more weight than verbal communication because it tends to be more authentic and less controlled. In fact, there's been some studies with therapists, with counselors, and one thing that they found is simply looking at tone of voice and nothing else is a good predictor of perceived success by the client. Because just reading the tone of voice of an authentic therapist can go a long ways to making that client feel heard and understood. So let's take a look at some of the functions of nonverbal cues, because nonverbal communication really refers to several important functions in social perception. First off, we have conveying emotion. And we can think here in terms of facial expression, how powerful that is in expressing emotion. A smile or a frown can quickly communicate happiness or displeasure. It can also regulate social interactions. So body language and gestures often signal when it is someone else's turn to speak or to act in a conversation. So, for example, leaning forward can indicate interest, while crossing arms might indicate defensiveness. There's the whole idea of reinforcing or contradicting verbal messages. So nonverbal cues can either strengthen or they can contradict what a person is saying verbally. So for instance, I'm fine with a frustrated tone or a grimace sends very mixed messages. And it can also help to establish dominance or submission. So posture and gestures can indicate power dynamics. So for example, standing tall with hands on their hips can signal confidence or dominance, while slouching can suggest submission or insecurity. Now, of course, there is cultural differences in nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication is not a universal thing, and there are cultural differences that can significantly influence how nonverbal cues are expressed and perceived. So, for example, in some cultures, direct eye contact is a sign of confidence and honesty, but in others, it's seen as disrespectful and confrontational. Gestures with, like, for example, thumbs up or a sign of okay is common in Western cultures, but in other parts of the world, it's considered to be offensive. And then there's the whole idea of proxemics, and this is the use of personal space, and that can vary greatly from different parts of the world as well. In the Western world, we kind of have this 3-foot bubble around ourselves, but people from different cultures feel comfortable at different distances. Had a friend that grew up in India, and he had a comfort space of maybe 4 inches, so he would put his face about 4 inches away from you and have a conversation with you, which seemed very violating and aggressive, but he was just being friendly. And then when I went to India and saw where he went to school, I realized, oh, they're cramming 100 kids into a little tiny room for classrooms for school, so there is no personal space, and that's how they grew up. So I started to understand that a little bit more. Now, there's some other interesting things, and you might have heard of a show called Lie to Me, where someone could just read people's facial expressions and understand more about them. Well, that TV show is based upon a researcher by the name of Paul Ekman, who did a lot of work with universal facial expressions, and it really kind of revolutionized our understanding of emotion. And Ekman and Friesen's studies showed that certain facial expressions, such as those of happiness, and sadness, and anger, and fear, and even disgust and surprise, are recognized across cultures. And this suggests that some of these basic facial expressions are biologically based. But there is still some cultural display rules that happen in there. And Ekman also recognized this. So, for example, basic expressions of sadness may be universal, but some cultures may encourage the suppression of sadness, say, for example, in public, leading to differences in how people display their emotions. So all of these nonverbal cues are things that can be automatic and processed quickly, but they also have a significant social component to them as well. So, tying all of this together, social perception and attribution, how do we bring this into our life? Well, it's really important within interpersonal relationships for sure, because social perception plays really a vital role in how we navigate our personal relationships. Whether we're talking with a friend or we're dealing with a romantic relationship, the way that we perceive and interpret others' behaviors can either strengthen or weaken those bonds. And when we think in terms of attribution biases, this can often come into play during conflict. So, for instance, in a disagreement, individuals might make dispositional attributions of their partner's behavior, like you're being selfish, you're being a jerk, rather than considering the situational factors like, oh, you had a stressful day, oh, you're not feeling well, you're fighting the flu. And being aware of such biases can really improve empathy and communication and lead to healthier relationships. And then there's also judgment in legal and medical cases. And this can be fairly significant because attribution processes are also highly relevant in professional settings, particularly in legal or medical fields. So, for example, in legal contexts, jurors make attributions about defendants' actions, weighing whether they believe a crime was committed due to internal disposition, so for example, criminal intent, or external circumstances like coercion. And attribution errors, such as the fundamental attribution error, can lead to biased judgments that make can unfairly penalize defendants for factors beyond their control. And the same thing can happen in medical contexts. So doctors can attribute to patients symptoms to psychological causes, internal attributions, or they might actually result from an undiagnosed medical condition, an external attribution. So misattributions in both fields can have some serious consequences, including wrongful convictions or misdiagnosis. And, this is something that we all need to deal with all the time within life. We're not as accurate as we actually think we are in reading situations. This also brings up the whole issue of stereotypes and prejudice. So stereotypes are those oversimplified schemas that can lead to biased perceptions or unfair judgments about individuals based upon their group membership. So, for example, a person might incorrectly attribute a behavior to someone's race or gender or social status due to their stereotypical beliefs. And then there is prejudice, which is often rooted in faulty attributions. And it is the negative evaluation of individuals based on their group identity. So attribution errors, such as assuming that behavior is due to inherent personality traits rather than situational factors, contribute to prejudiced thinking and discriminatory behavior. So understanding how attributions influence stereotypes and prejudice is essential for reducing bias and fostering inclusivity. So in the end, social perception and attribution are really fundamental processes that we need to be aware of that shape the way that we understand and interact with the world around us. And when we are aware of the biases and the errors in these processes, so for example, the fundamental attribution error or the actor-observer bias or confirmation bias, this can lead to more accurate judgments and better interpersonal relationships that we have with others. And when we recognize that our perceptions are not always objective, that can help us to improve our own empathy and our own communication and our own decision making. And that leads us to the last little review for this class, where I want to kind of highlight 3 key terms. The first one is the fundamental attribution error, and this is the tendency to overestimate the role of internal characteristics, what we call the dispositional factors, and underestimate the role of external circumstances, what we call the situational factors, when explaining others' behavior. So, for example, if someone cuts you off in traffic, you might assume that they're a jerk, that they're an aggressive driver. These are dispositional attributions, without considering that they might be rushing to the hospital because they have a medical emergency, which would be a situational attribution. Then there are social schemas, and these schemas are cognitive frameworks that help us organize and interpret all of the social information that we have, because there's a lot and we need a structure in order to make sense of it. But these will influence how we perceive others by filling in the gaps in our knowledge, because we don't always have all the information. And we fill in the gaps with our prior experiences and with generalizations that we have. So, for example, we have a schema for a teacher, and we automatically assume certain traits about someone introduced to us as a teacher, for example. Then there's the self-serving bias, and this is the tendency to attribute successes to internal factors, such as one's own abilities or efforts, while attributing failures to external factors, such as bad luck or external circumstances. So, for example, if you do well on a test, you might attribute it to your intelligence. But if you fail, you might blame the difficulty of the exam. And then finally, we have a multiple choice question and the answer there for you to review. And just remember that these will typically be part of the quizzes that we do, so do pay some special attention to these. And as we conclude our lecture here on social perception and attribution, I think it's really important for you to remember that these cognitive processes are vital to our everyday interactions, but that they're not perfect, that they're not without their flaws. They're useful, but they're imperfect. And by being more aware of the biases and the errors that we carry, we can influence how we perceive and judge others, and hopefully give others more grace. And then we can improve our understanding of social dynamics, and we can become just a little more empathetic and a little more thoughtful of individuals, and a little more willing to dive in a little deeper and get more information, because we never have quite enough information to make an accurate opinion. And when we are, especially when we are operating on our first impressions, we're going to fail. And it's important to reduce misunderstandings and conflict and gather as much information as we can in a slow, methodical way. Hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you next week. You take care. Goodbye.